In Beijing this week, the world watched a spectacle that may come to define a new era in global politics. On the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, China staged what observers describe as the largest military parade in its history. The scale was staggering. Tens of thousands of troops marched in lockstep through Tiananmen Square. Columns of tanks and missile carriers rolled past in flawless formation. Overhead, formations of fighter jets, bombers, and drones filled the skies in a display carefully choreographed to demonstrate not just strength, but precision, order, and resolve. This was no ordinary commemoration. It was a declaration, one meant for the entire world to hear. At the center stood Xi Jinping, framed not only by his generals, but by the presence of two men whose attendance carried equal weight: Vladimir Putin of Russia and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. The sight of these three leaders, shoulder to shoulder, turned the parade from a national celebration into a signal of something much larger. Analysts are calling it the public unveiling of an emerging anti-Western axis, what some describe as an axis of upheaval. Each leader brings his own motivations. For Xi, the parade was an assertion that China has risen to claim its place as a central power, no longer content to follow rules written elsewhere. For Putin, locked in confrontation with NATO and bleeding under sanctions, it was an opportunity to show Russia is not isolated, that it still has powerful allies. For Kim, long regarded as a pariah, it was recognition, a chance to stand on equal footing in a coalition that can no longer be ignored. Together, the symbolism was unmistakable. China, Russia, and North Korea are aligning themselves not as outliers, but as an alternative, a bloc that rejects Western dominance and seeks to build a parallel order of its own. The weapons paraded through Beijing underscored the point. Hypersonic missiles, stealth aircraft, unmanned drone swarms, and naval systems designed for power projection. Each a reminder that China is not merely catching up, but is preparing to challenge the West across every domain of modern warfare. What makes this moment historic is not the hardware itself, but the shift in the symbolic center of world politics. For decades, Washington represented the undisputed hub of global leadership. But Beijing's parade, with Putin and Kim standing alongside Xi, was staged as a rival claim, a visual declaration that power is no longer unipolar. Western observers see in this an unmistakable pivot. The liberal order forged after World War II, anchored by American power, now faces open contest. This is not a return to the Cold War, but something different, a multipolar struggle where rival blocs seek to carve out spheres of influence, build their own systems of trade, technology, and security, and resist integration into a Western framework. The implications are profound. With China's industrial base, Russia's energy and military experience, and North Korea's nuclear leverage, the axis represents a fusion of strengths that cannot be dismissed. And unlike in the past, this alignment is not hidden. It is marching in formation. It is flying overhead. It is speaking directly to audiences at home and abroad. For the United States and its allies, the question is urgent. How should they respond? To ignore the axis risks underestimating its potential. To confront it directly risks driving these powers even closer together. And yet, the longer Washington waits, the more Beijing consolidates its claim as the new symbolic center of global politics. The Beijing parade was intended to honor history. Instead, it may have made history. It marked the moment when the world saw not just a celebration of China's rise, but the contours of a new bloc, one that openly declares its intention to challenge the West and reshape the rules of international power. In early October, the world's most powerful energy cartel will adjust the levers of global supply once again. OPEC+, the coalition of oil-producing nations, led by Saudi Arabia and Russia, is preparing to approve another modest increase in production. On paper, this is part of a long-term plan. Earlier this year, OPEC+ cut production sharply in an effort to stabilize falling prices and protect revenues for its members. Those cuts did succeed in tightening supply, but they also drew fierce criticism from importing nations, especially in the West, who accused the cartel of using energy as a political tool. Now, the rollback of those cuts is moving forward, but at a deliberately slower pace. The planned increase in October is described as Modest, a signal that OPEC Plus is not willing to flood markets and risk losing control of prices. Instead, it is calibrating supply carefully, sending a message that the cartel remains both cautious and firmly in charge. But here's the key. Despite these incremental increases, oil prices remain elevated. The reasons go far beyond OPEC's production quotas. First, Western sanctions on Russia and Iran continue to constrain supply. Russia, one of the world's top exporters, faces sweeping restrictions due to the war in Ukraine. Iran, meanwhile, is hemmed in by decades-old sanctions tied to its nuclear program. Together, these two countries represent millions of barrels per day that are either off the market or being sold at steep discounts through gray channels. Second, demand remains strong. Despite fears of economic slowdown, major economies in Asia, led by China and India, continue to import heavily. In fact, discounted Russian and Iranian crude has flowed disproportionately to these markets, reinforcing new energy alignments outside the Western financial system. For Washington and Brussels, the challenge is clear. Sanctions were designed to punish Moscow and Tehran, but in practice they have helped keep global prices high, cushioning OPEC Plus revenues while placing additional strain on Western consumers already battling inflation. For OPEC Plus, this dynamic is almost perfect. High prices mean robust revenues for producers. Controlled, modest increases keep the cartel's credibility intact. And the sanctions on Russia and Iran limit Western options to bring prices down by alternative means. But the consequences ripple far beyond the energy market. Elevated oil prices feed into global inflation, weighing heavily on developing nations that lack the resources to subsidize fuel. They complicate monetary policy for central banks already caught between inflation and stagnation. And they highlight, once again, just how much leverage OPEC Plus still wields, despite repeated Western promises to diversify away from fossil fuels. The modest October hike, then, is not just an economic adjustment. It is a strategic signal. OPEC Plus is reminding the world that it remains the central node of energy politics, capable of fine-tuning markets on its own terms, while sanctions and geopolitics do the rest of the work. As long as Western restrictions keep Russian and Iranian barrels constrained, OPEC Plus will continue to hold the upper hand. And as this week's decision shows, the cartel intends to use that leverage carefully, not to collapse the system, but to remind the world that when it comes to oil, the balance of power still rests firmly with them. In Washington this week, the Trump administration made a move as symbolic as it was provocative. The Department of Defense, a name that for decades reflected America's role as both protector and global enforcer, has officially been rebranded as the Department of War. The change may seem cosmetic, but its implications run deep. Words matter. By shedding the language of defense, President Trump is making a statement. The United States is not just preparing to guard itself, but to project power more openly, both abroad and at home. Within days of the rebrand, Trump threatened to deploy federal troops into American cities. Portland, Chicago, New Orleans, all singled out as potential targets for intervention in response to unrest and rising crime. Critics argue this marks a dangerous blurring of lines between civilian policing and military force. Supporters counter that it is long overdue, a show of strength against lawlessness. Either way, the message is clear. Under Trump, militarization is not limited to foreign policy. It is part of the domestic toolkit. But the posture doesn't stop there. Beyond America's borders, the administration is flexing muscle in ways that underscore this new philosophy. 10 F-35 stealth fighters have been deployed to Puerto Rico, extending U.S. reach deep into the Caribbean. The Pentagon, or rather the new Department of War, has also leaked that it is weighing military strikes against targets in Venezuela under the justification of dismantling drug cartels. The combination is telling. Troops at home, jets abroad, the possibility of strikes in Latin America, all tied together by a narrative of threat, disruption, and the need for overwhelming force. For some, this represents a return to clarity, calling things what they are, acknowledging that America's military is not simply for defense, but for war. For others, it raises alarm bells, a shift that normalizes domestic militarization while preparing the ground for escalation overseas. The deployment of F-35s to Puerto Rico is especially significant. Officially, the mission is about counter-narcotics operations, but in reality, it places some of America's most advanced strike aircraft within close reach of Venezuela, a country already locked in confrontation with Washington. Combined with a growing U.S. naval presence in the Caribbean, the picture begins to look less like routine operations and more like positioning for potential conflict. Taken together, these moves reflect a broader pattern, an increasingly militaristic posture that spans from America's own streets to its near abroad. Renaming the Department of Defense was more than branding. It was the unveiling of a worldview, one where force is central, where adversaries are confronted directly, and where even domestic challenges are met with military solutions. The world is watching closely. Allies wonder whether this signals a lasting shift in U.S. doctrine. Rivals from Caracas to Moscow to Beijing will read it as confirmation of what they have long suspected, that under Trump, America is shedding the veneer of restraint and embracing the raw language of war. The relationship between Washington and New Delhi, once described as a cornerstone of the 21st century, is now entering its most serious crisis in decades. This week, the Trump administration imposed steep tariffs on Indian exports, in some cases as high as 50%. The measures were directly tied to India's decision to continue purchasing discounted Russian oil, a move Washington claims undermines sanctions against Moscow and weakens Western leverage in the war in Ukraine. For India, the reaction was immediate and sharp. Officials condemned the tariffs as unjust and politically motivated. Behind the scenes, New Delhi has begun hinting at something even more consequential: a potential pause in defense purchases from American suppliers. That would represent a dramatic shift. Over the last 2 decades, India has become one of the largest buyers of U.S. military equipment, from helicopters to drones to advanced surveillance systems. These sales were more than commerce. They were part of a broader strategic alignment designed to counterbalance China's rise in the Indo-Pacific. If those purchases are put on hold, the impact would ripple far beyond trade. It would strike at the heart of the U.S.-India security partnership and undermine the credibility of the Quad alliance, the grouping of the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia that has been central to Washington's Asia strategy. Analysts warn this rift could not come at a worse time. China continues to expand its influence across the region, from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. The Quad was meant to provide a united front, but if Washington and New Delhi are locked in a tariff war, the very foundation of that cooperation begins to erode. The crisis also reveals deeper contradictions. India has long insisted on pursuing what it calls strategic autonomy, maintaining ties with Russia while building closer links with the West. For Washington, that balancing act has grown harder to tolerate, especially as the confrontation with Moscow drags on. Trump's tariffs are a clear signal. Loyalty comes at a price, and neutrality is no longer an option. But India is not without leverage. It represents not only the world's most populous democracy, but also one of the fastest-growing markets for energy and defense. Alienating New Delhi could push it closer to alternative suppliers, whether in Europe, Israel, or even back to Moscow. The longer this standoff continues, the more it threatens to fracture a partnership that was once seen as a pillar of U.S. foreign policy. Instead of deepening cooperation to counter China, Washington and New Delhi now find themselves locked in confrontation. The tariffs may have been meant to punish Russia's backdoor to global markets. Instead, they risk opening a rift between 2 democracies whose cooperation has been central to the balance of power in Asia. If cooler heads do not prevail, the cost will be more than economic. It could be the unraveling of a strategic partnership that took decades to build, and the weakening of the very alliance meant to shape the future of the Indo-Pacific. Stay informed on the world's shifting power. Subscribe to the Watchtower Report, where strategy meets reality.